Okay, in this video we're going to go through and create a brand new scene, and we're going to explore the idea of iterating on a shape and exploring forms, and the idea of taking something really simple and rather than staying really simple, going a little bit beyond. So to start this off, we're just going to go ahead, I'm going to hold down Shift and click on New. I don't need to save that because that's the default scene. You can do that from the splash page as well. I'll just give you a blank scene. We're going to start off with something really simple, super simple. We won't go with the gradient, we'll go with the slope noise, which is a little bit more than a gradient. So we get something, you know, relatively interesting. Starting shape, primitive, but it's there. And I'm going to go ahead and do something that I think would be interesting. I'll just go ahead and I'll throw a fold on there, and not so much. This particular case, this slope itself doesn't really lend itself much to the usage of something like this with fold. I need to do something more with it than this. Of course, I could go ahead and try, say, an erosion instead, and I wrote it, and it looks okay, but after a while this starts to get a little bit old, right? You know, you've got this flowing piles of dirt, and they're beautiful, don't get me wrong, but maybe we want to go a little bit beyond that. So if the fold's not giving me anything, and this is not doing much for me, what else can I play with? I've got, you know, landform here, and that's kind of interesting. Let's switch this up to 1K so we see a little bit more detail with these. So going from here to here, not much. Here to landform, and landform, just weird, right? I mean, what am I going to do with that? So I'm going to start this off in a different way. I'm going to start off with a displace node. And that displace node, initially, it's not doing much. I'm going to go ahead and take those iterations. I'm going to bring them up to, say, about 10. And this is, you know, somewhat costly, but I'm getting something interesting off of this. I want it to go the other direction, so I'm just going to do that in roughly 90-degree rotation. Somewhere around there. Oh, exactly 90. Lucky. So that's kind of neat. But it's still not quite there. It looks kind of like Perlin, right? It's not unique enough to justify the number of iterations that I'm going to go through. I mean, I bring this up to something like 4K, it's going to take a while. So if it's going to be that big of a deal, I want it to be worth my time. So I'm going to go rugged. So the rugged doesn't really take any longer than the regular displace, but the end result is certainly a lot more interesting. So now if I take something like this and I go ahead and fold it, you're going to see there's a lot more interesting shape and form to that. How about if we were to switch our landform off of this? So went from this to landform. No, that's still pretty weird, but how about if we fold off that one? That's also quite interesting. So we've got two different variations on fold, which provide us with a much more interesting sort of starting shape. Now, I like to experiment. I like to play with a lot of these things and see where I can go with stuff. So I'm actually going to take the two of these and let's combine them together and see what we get off of that. So combined together, we get a lot of smaller details, you know, where both of these were creating quite large shapes and forms. There is some little subtle stuff in there, but not that much. But by combining these two together, I get lots of variation, and it changes the overall scale of this terrain. So remember that lovely erosion that we did over here? How about if we were to erode this instead? Because now we've got a little bit more complexity of shape. And lo and behold, now the erosion is also a little bit more interesting. Smooth, you know, flowing shapes. This one's got a little bit more ruggedness, a bit more roughness to the overall forms. Now it's still kind of piles of dirt. I want to work with something that's maybe a bit more on the range of rugged, as it were. So I've got this cool rock surface, and I've got this erosion. I could combine them together, but in another video I've showed you this particular process that we could use to not make it like piles of dirt, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'll plug in this fold, which is going to be my starting shape, and I'm going to come off the wear from this. So you can see it's coming off the wear. And take this up to 100. So this is what's going to be used. We're going to go ahead and subtract that. And now I'm getting some more eroded rock, but it's still a little bit rough. And what I did like about this particular form is, you know, how there was that added sort of layer of complexity. But when I eroded it directly, I got this. Because it was based off of combining these two forms together, I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to take this, put this in here, go ahead and throw that in there, and look at this. Here's my soft eroded hills, and here I'm getting the same shapes, but instead of soft eroded hills, I'm getting sort of soft eroded rock. Right? It still maintains that feeling of rock. Pretty cool. I would like a little bit of those sand flows or something like that. So I have a few different options. Inside of Gaea we have things like sediment and snow that we could use to work with this. How about we go ahead with sediment. Just drop that in there. And that's going to put like a light dusting everywhere, which is okay, but I'm just going to hit drift and create a drift. Still got a bit up there, so I'm going to play with the seed a little bit. And that's going to move the drift around. So rather than, you know, hanging out heavily over here, it's moved. So that's one option. And like I said, the other option is going in for something like snow. Just because it says snow doesn't mean it has to be snow. It can be sand, it can be dirt, it can be all sorts of things. So how do we you know, iterate on this? Well, first off, determine if it's going in the places you want, right? You can quickly check, just go back and forth. I'm losing a lot of detail. I don't necessarily want that. I want it to maybe settle, right? Get it to settle down, sit lower on the rock maybe. And so it's, you know, settled a little bit, but not a heck of a lot. I could go with a little bit of melt and actually make it melt away. That gets rid of a little bit more of it. And so between the two of them, right, it just hangs on a lot more. It collects in different regions. And we have a snow line, a point at which, you know, it doesn't go below or go above. So we could go ahead and play with that, and we could control things a little bit further. So yeah, it doesn't go below the snow line. We could also mask it with something like a height node and say don't put it up above, but put it down below. So there's a few different ways that we could mess with this. What if we didn't want the idea of, say, you know, this sand concept? Maybe we wanted, instead of this being sand or snow, we wanted something like dirt, sort of rough dirt. Well, the first thing that I could do with that to, again, iterate on it, I could, let's see here, we could go with a blur, and before I start using it, I will just have it and have it again, 0.5, that should be good, and we'll plug in the snow mask to that. That should maintain enough detail to the shape, but otherwise provide me with a softer transition, because if you use the snow outright, the snow mask outright, the edges are quite harsh. So in order to do this next blending portion, I'm going to want something like that. So let's go with the Perlin, and we're going to go for a low value here, and maybe billowy. Make it smaller, increase those octaves. So that looks kind of like piles of dirt. Let's go with that. We'll add that in. I'm going to take this, combine, we'll add some, oops, we'll add our dirt, as it were, and that's going everywhere. And we'll just go ahead and mask that off. And of course, it's going all the way down. We don't want to blend where it goes and, you know, shows us Perlin in one section, which is, you know, ground bottom, and this we want to add it on top of that snow region, which is flat and simple. So we'll just go ahead and screen that. So now, instead of simple and soft, we got something a bit more rough. Actually, let's go ahead with that snow. And there we go. So it's got a little bit more dimensionality to it. It's not just simple, soft piles. It's got a little bit more shape to it, which is nice. So this is that process of iteration, right? You're going through, and rather than just going with something simple, you start to experiment with form. You combine this with that and other things, and the idea is to get something a little bit more complex to start with. The simpler the form, the simpler, you know, your end result is going to be. So adding complexity comes from iterating on a shape, iterating on a form, trying a few different experiments, combining those experiments, seeing what happens, right? Starting to recognize patterns like I have here, where I go between this one and I get this form and I erode it. Well, that's cool. What if I take that erosion back off of this one and then I combine it back with the other one, and I'll get something similar but different, unique. So don't be afraid to experiment. Try things out and then try and understand what it is they're doing. What kind of things is it offering you? Sometimes they will be spectacular failures, and that's not a problem. You know, experimentation and failure are the best way to learn and get really into this software, or any software. You watch a little kid go at a piece of software and they will go at it with abandon. They'll sit there, they'll click every button, they'll pull on sliders, they'll go through the menus, and you know, they don't really care. They're not terribly afraid of failure. We learn to be afraid of failure at a later point. We say, oh, well, I'm making something, you know, I don't want to ruin it. Don't worry about ruining it. Take some time to experiment, explore, sit down for half an hour, just trying stuff out, just see what happens. And then after you've done some of that experimentation, you've learned a few things, then you can sit down and say, okay, now I'm going to build an actual train with something that I've learned from this process. So, you know, little speed exercises, exploration, and not being afraid of, you know, messing things up. That's the best way to learn. So hopefully you got something useful from this video, and I'll see you in the next one.